The first snowflakes of December began to fall softly against the tall windows of the cozy cottage, each flake dancing like tiny ballerinas performing their winter ballet. Inside the warm kitchen, the sweet aroma of freshly baked gingerbread cookies filled every corner, mixing with the comforting scent of cinnamon and vanilla that seemed to wrap around everything like a gentle hug. Grandma Eleanor stood at the wooden counter, her silver hair catching the golden light from the overhead lamp, while her weathered but gentle hands carefully rolled out another batch of cookie dough. At 73 years old, Eleanor had perfected the art of making Christmas magical for her 3 beloved grandchildren. Her small cottage, nestled at the edge of a quiet village, had become the heart of their family's Christmas celebrations over the past 5 years. What had started as a simple visit during the holidays had gradually transformed into the most treasured tradition the children had ever known. The old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, signaling that the children would arrive soon. Eleanor smiled to herself, remembering how this special tradition had begun quite by accident. 5 years ago, when George was only 6, Charlotte was 4, and little Louis was barely 2, a sudden snowstorm had trapped them all at her cottage for 3 days during Christmas week. What could have been a disaster had turned into the most wonderful Christmas any of them had ever experienced. Eleanor wiped her flour-dusted hands on her favorite red apron, the one with tiny holly leaves embroidered along the edges that her late husband had given her 20 years ago. She walked over to the window and peered out at the snow-covered garden where her rose bushes stood like sleeping soldiers under white blankets. The old wooden swing that hung from the ancient oak tree swayed gently in the winter breeze, waiting patiently for warmer days when little hands would grip its ropes again. The sound of car doors slamming and excited voices carried through the crisp winter air, causing Eleanor's heart to flutter with anticipation. She hurried to the front door, her slippers making soft shuffling sounds against the worn wooden floors. Before she could even turn the brass doorknob, she heard Charlotte's melodic voice calling out, "Grandma! We're here! The snow is so pretty!" Eleanor opened the door to find 3 rosy-cheeked faces beaming up at her, their eyes sparkling with the kind of pure joy that only children possess during the Christmas season. George, now 11, stood tall and proud, his dark hair peeking out from under a navy blue knit cap. His smile revealed the gap where his front tooth used to be, a reminder that he was growing up faster than anyone wanted to admit. Charlotte, 9 years old with golden curls that bounced with every step, clutched a small wrapped package against her bright red coat. And Louis, 7 now but still her baby in many ways, jumped up and down in his little snow boots, leaving tiny footprints on the porch. "My darlings!" Eleanor exclaimed, opening her arms wide as the 3 children rushed into her embrace. She breathed in the sweet scent of their hair mixed with the fresh winter air, feeling her heart swell with a love so deep it almost brought tears to her eyes. "Look how you've all grown since I saw you last month." Behind the children, their parents stood with warm smiles, carrying overnight bags and gift boxes. Eleanor's daughter Sarah looked tired but happy, her cheeks pink from the cold drive. "Mom, the cookies smell incredible," Sarah said, giving her mother a gentle kiss on the cheek. "The children have been talking about this weekend non-stop for 3 weeks. Have you started without us, Grandma?" George asked, his voice cracking slightly as it had begun to do recently, making him sound older and younger at the same time. "We brought our special ingredients like you asked." Eleanor's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Oh my dear boy, we're just getting started. This year's Christmas cookie adventure is going to be our most special yet." She ushered everyone inside, helping to remove coats and scarves while the children immediately began exploring the cottage as if seeing it for the first time, even though they knew every corner by heart. The tradition had evolved naturally over the years. What began as simple cookie baking had grown into an elaborate 3-day celebration that the children called Grandma's Christmas Magic Weekend. Each year, Eleanor would prepare special activities, but the heart of it all remained the same: spending precious time together, creating memories, and keeping the wonder of Christmas alive in their young hearts. Charlotte ran her small fingers along the familiar kitchen counter where flour still dusted the surface. "Grandma, are we making the gingerbread village again this year? And the sugar cookies with the colored icing? And the chocolate crinkles that get all crackly on top? All of those and more, my sweet girl, Eleanor replied, tying a small apron around Charlotte's waist. But, first, we need to follow our special tradition. Do you remember what comes first? Louis, who had been quietly examining the cookie cutters arranged on the table, suddenly perked up. Hot chocolate. With the tiny marshmallows and the candy canes for stirring. That's right, my clever boy, Eleanor laughed, ruffling his sandy brown hair. But, not just any hot chocolate. We make it together, with our secret ingredient. George rolled his eyes good-naturedly, though his grin betrayed his excitement. Grandma, we know the secret ingredient is love. You tell us every year. Ah, but, love isn't something you can measure with a cup or a spoon, Eleanor said wisely, pulling out the large red pot that was reserved specifically for their Christmas hot chocolate. Love is in how we do things together, how we take care of each other, and how we make each other smile. As Sarah and her husband settled their luggage in the guest rooms upstairs, Eleanor gathered her grandchildren around the stove. The kitchen, with its pale yellow walls decorated with children's artwork from previous visits, became a bustling center of activity. Each child had their assigned task, learned and perfected over years of practice. George, being the eldest, was in charge of measuring the milk and cream. He took this responsibility seriously, using the glass measuring cup with careful precision. Charlotte's job was to unwrap the chocolate squares and break them into small pieces, a task she performed with the concentration of a surgeon. Louis, still small enough to need a step stool, was the official marshmallow counter, making sure there were exactly 7 mini marshmallows for each mug. Tell us about when you were little, Grandma, Charlotte asked as she carefully arranged chocolate pieces in a small bowl. What were your favorite Christmas traditions when you were my age? Eleanor's eyes grew soft and distant as she slowly stirred the warming milk. When I was about your age, Charlotte, my grandmother had a tradition very similar to this one. She lived in a house much smaller than this cottage, with only 2 bedrooms and a kitchen so tiny you could barely fit 3 people in it at once. The children gathered closer, even George abandoning his typical preteen coolness to hear one of Grandma Eleanor's stories. She had a gift for storytelling, painting pictures with words that made her childhood come alive in their imaginations. Every Christmas Eve, my grandmother would gather all her grandchildren, there were 6 of us, in her little kitchen. We would make the simplest cookies you can imagine, just flour, butter, sugar, and an egg. No fancy decorations, no colored icing, nothing like the beautiful creations we make together. Louis looked puzzled. But, Grandma, that doesn't sound very fun. Our cookies are so pretty with all the decorations. Eleanor smiled, adding the chocolate pieces to the warming milk and watching them slowly melt into swirls of brown sweetness. You know what made those simple cookies the most delicious treats in the world? It was being together. It was my grandmother's hands guiding mine as I learned to roll the dough. It was the way she would hum old Christmas songs while we worked. It was how she made each of us feel like we were the most important person in the world. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. Like how you make us feel? Exactly like that, my darling girl. George added the final measurement of cream to the pot, and the rich mixture began to steam gently. Grandma, is that why you started this tradition with us? Because of your grandmother? Eleanor paused in her stirring, considering the question carefully. In a way, yes. When you 3 were smaller, and we got snowed in that first Christmas, I wanted to give you something special. Something that would make you feel the same way I felt in my grandmother's kitchen all those years ago. I wanted you to know that Christmas isn't about the presents under the tree or the fancy dinner on the table. It's about being together, the 3 children said in unison, having heard this wisdom many times before. That's right. Christmas is about love, and kindness, and taking care of the people who matter most to us. The hot chocolate reached the perfect temperature, rich and creamy with the chocolate completely melted into silky smoothness. Eleanor carefully ladled it into 4 mismatched mugs. Each child had claimed their favorite over the years. George's mug was dark blue with a painted snowman, Charlotte's was pink with tiny roses, and Louis's featured a family of penguins wearing red scarves. Louis climbed down from his step stool and carefully counted out marshmallows for each mug. 7, 8, 9. Grandma, can I have 1 extra marshmallow this year? I'm bigger now. I think that can be arranged, Eleanor said with a wink, adding an 8th marshmallow to Louis's mug. But, only because you've been such a good helper. They settled around the small round table by the window, where Eleanor had placed a red and green checkered tablecloth and a small vase filled with holly branches from the garden. Outside, the snow continued to fall, creating a perfect winter wonderland that looked like it belonged on a Christmas card. Charlotte wrapped her small hands around her warm mug, breathing in the sweet, chocolatey steam. Grandma, what are we going to bake first this year? Well, Eleanor said, settling into her chair with her own steaming mug, I thought we might start with something new this year. I found a recipe for cinnamon star cookies that my great-grandmother used to make in Germany. They're quite special because the dough needs to rest overnight, so we'll make them today and bake them tomorrow. George's eyes lit up with interest. Are they hard to make? Can we really do it? My dear boy, there's nothing we can't do when we work together. The recipe has been in our family for over 100 years. I thought it was time to share it with you 3. Louis took a careful sip of his hot chocolate, leaving a small mustache of foam on his upper lip. Will you teach us the German words too, Grandma? Like you taught us how to say Merry Christmas in French last year? Of course. The cookies are called Zimstern, which means cinnamon stars. Can you say that? The children attempted the pronunciation, their efforts resulting in giggles and good-natured teasing as they tried to wrap their tongues around the unfamiliar sounds. Eleanor listened to their laughter, memorizing the sound and storing it in her heart alongside thousands of other precious moments they had shared. Grandma, Charlotte said suddenly, her voice taking on a more serious tone, will we always have this tradition? Even when we're grown up like Mommy and Daddy? Eleanor felt a familiar tug in her chest, the bittersweet awareness that children grow up and lives change in ways no one can predict. But, she smiled warmly and reached across the table to touch Charlotte's hand. My sweet girl, traditions are like seeds. When you plant them in your heart and take care of them, they grow and bloom for many, many years. Someday, when you're all grown up, you might have children of your own. And, maybe, just maybe, you'll want to share some of the magic we create together. George nodded seriously. I want to make hot chocolate with my kids someday. And, I want to tell them about you, Grandma. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were happy tears, full of love and hope for the future. That would make me very happy indeed. They finished their hot chocolate in comfortable companionship, watching the snow pile higher on the windowsill while planning their weekend of baking adventures. The cottage felt warm and alive with their presence, every room seeming to sparkle with the anticipation of the magical days ahead. As the afternoon light began to fade, Eleanor stood up and clapped her hands together. Well then, my dear bakers, shall we begin our first Christmas creation? Those cinnamon stars won't make themselves. The children jumped up eagerly, their energy renewed by the hot chocolate and the promise of new adventures. As they moved into the kitchen, Eleanor took one last look out the window at the falling snow, feeling grateful beyond words for these precious moments with her grandchildren. This was how their Christmas magic always began, with warm mugs, sweet treats, and hearts full of love. As she watched her grandchildren chatter excitedly while gathering ingredients, Eleanor knew that whatever challenges life might bring, they would always have these perfect moments to remember, these traditions that bound their family together across generations. The real adventure was just beginning, and her heart was already full to overflowing. The next morning arrived with a magical stillness that only comes after a heavy snowfall. Eleanor woke early, as was her habit, and padded softly to the kitchen in her warm slippers. The world outside her window looked like a winter wonderland painted in shades of white and silver. Tree branches bent gracefully under the weight of fresh snow, and the old garden shed wore a thick white cap that made it look like a gingerbread house from a fairy tale. She started the coffee maker and began preparing breakfast, humming softly to herself as she moved around the familiar kitchen. The cinnamon star cookie dough they had prepared the evening before sat resting in the refrigerator, ready for today's baking adventure. Eleanor smiled as she remembered the children's excitement when they had successfully mixed the traditional German recipe, their small hands working together to combine ground almonds, sugar, egg whites, and aromatic cinnamon. The sound of feet thundering down the wooden stairs announced that her grandchildren were awake. Louis appeared first, his hair sticking up in every direction and his favorite dinosaur pajamas slightly twisted from sleep. He rubbed his eyes sleepily and shuffled over to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her legs in a warm morning hug. "Good morning, my sunshine," Eleanor said, smoothing down his unruly hair. "Did you sleep well?" Louis nodded, still not fully awake. "I dreamed about the cookie stars. They were dancing in the sky with real stars, and they were singing Christmas songs. What a wonderful dream. Maybe we can make it come true by giving our cookies some magic today." Charlotte bounced into the kitchen next, already dressed in her favorite Christmas sweater decorated with tiny reindeer. Her golden curls had been hastily brushed, and her eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Good morning, Grandma. Is today the day we make the star cookies? And can we start decorating the gingerbread house?" "Good morning, my eager little baker," Eleanor laughed, giving Charlotte a squeeze. "Yes, today we'll bake our cinnamon stars, but first we need to wake up properly with a good breakfast." George was the last to appear, moving with the careful dignity of an 11-year-old who was trying to appear more grown-up than he felt. His dark hair had been combed neatly, and he had chosen his clothes with obvious care, a green sweater that Eleanor had knitted for him the previous Christmas and his favorite jeans. "Morning, Grandma," he said, accepting her hug with only a slight teenage awkwardness. "Something smells really good." Eleanor had prepared their traditional weekend breakfast, fluffy pancakes shaped like Christmas trees, crispy bacon, and fresh orange juice served in glasses decorated with tiny candy canes. She had learned long ago that hungry children were not good bakers, so she always made sure they were well fed before beginning their kitchen adventures. As they ate, the children chattered excitedly about their plans for the day. Charlotte wanted to make sugar cookies shaped like angels and paint them with edible gold dust. Louis was fascinated by the idea of making chocolate-covered pretzels that looked like tiny wreaths. George, trying to balance his grown-up sensibilities with his genuine excitement, suggested they should make some sophisticated cookies for the adults. "Grandma," Charlotte said between bites of pancake, "last night I was thinking about what you said about traditions being like seeds. I want to plant a really good seed this year." Eleanor paused in cutting Louis's pancakes into smaller pieces. "What kind of seed would you like to plant, sweetheart?" Charlotte's face grew serious with the importance of her idea. "I want to make extra cookies to give away. Not just to family, but to people who might not have anyone to bake with them." The kitchen fell quiet as the adults and children absorbed this thoughtful suggestion. Eleanor felt her heart swell with pride at her granddaughter's compassionate nature. George looked up from his breakfast, his expression thoughtful. "That's actually a really good idea, Charlotte. Remember Mrs. Henderson who lives alone down the street from us? Mom always says she doesn't have family nearby." Louis nodded enthusiastically. "And what about the postman? He brings letters even in the snow. He might like cookies." Eleanor reached over and touched Charlotte's hand gently. "My dear girl, that is one of the most beautiful ideas I've ever heard. Sharing our baking with others is exactly the kind of magic that makes Christmas special." Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, came into the kitchen with tears in her eyes. "Mom, the children amaze me sometimes. They really understand what you've been teaching them about the spirit of Christmas." "Children have naturally generous hearts," Eleanor said softly. "They just need adults to help them find ways to express that generosity." After breakfast, Eleanor gathered her grandchildren around the kitchen island for their daily baking lesson. She had discovered over the years that each child learned differently, so she tried to involve all their senses in the process. Today's lesson was about the history and tradition behind the cookies they would be making. "Before we begin baking," Eleanor said, pulling out an old wooden box from the highest kitchen shelf, "I want to show you something very special." The children gathered close as Eleanor carefully opened the box. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age, were several items that looked like they belonged in a museum. There was a worn wooden rolling pin, its surface smooth from decades of use, a set of metal cookie cutters that had lost their shine but retained their perfect shapes, and a small recipe book written in spidery handwriting. "These belong to my great-grandmother, the one I told you about yesterday," Eleanor explained, her voice soft with reverence. "She brought them with her when she came to America over 100 years ago. This rolling pin has made thousands and thousands of cookies." George reached out tentatively to touch the old rolling pin. "Can we use it today, Grandma? To make our cookies?" "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask," Eleanor smiled. "These tools were meant to be used, not just admired. Today, you'll be part of a tradition that stretches back through 4 generations of our family." Charlotte carefully examined the recipe book, though she couldn't read the old German script. "What does it say, Grandma?" Eleanor opened to a specific page that had been marked with a faded ribbon. "This is the original recipe for Zimstern, the cinnamon star cookies we're making today. My great-grandmother wrote notes in the margins about what worked best, little tricks she learned through years of practice." Louis peered at the strange writing with fascination. "It looks like a secret code." "In a way, it is," Eleanor agreed. "It's the secret code of family love, passed down from one generation to the next." They spent the next hour carefully preparing their workspace. Eleanor had learned that organization was key to successful baking with children. Each child received their own set of measuring cups, mixing bowls, and special tasks that matched their abilities and interests. The cinnamon star cookies required patience and precision. The dough, which had rested overnight, needed to be rolled very thin and cut into perfect star shapes. Eleanor demonstrated the technique first, using the ancient rolling pin to create a sheet of dough so thin it was almost translucent. "The secret," she explained as the children watched intently, "is to roll from the center outward, turning the dough a quarter turn each time. This keeps it even and prevents it from sticking." George was the first to try, his movements careful and deliberate. The old rolling pin felt heavy in his hands, but he could sense the history it carried. As he rolled the dough, Eleanor guided his movements with gentle touches and encouraging words. "That's perfect, George. You're getting the feel for it. Notice how the dough responds to pressure, too much and it tears, too little and it won't get thin enough." Charlotte was next, her smaller hands requiring a different approach. Eleanor helped her adjust her grip and showed her how to use her body weight to help with the rolling motion. "It's like a dance," Eleanor told her. "Feel the rhythm of rolling and turning, rolling and turning." Louis needed the most help, but his enthusiasm made up for his lack of coordination. Eleanor stood behind him, her hands covering his as they rolled the dough together. "We're doing it together, little one. You're learning the same way I learned with my grandmother when I was your age." Once the dough was properly rolled, it was time for the cookie cutters. Eleanor brought out the star-shaped cutters in 3 different sizes, their metal edges sharp enough to create clean cuts but safe enough for small hands to manage. "This is my favorite part," Charlotte announced, carefully pressing the largest star cutter into the dough. "It's like magic, one minute it's just dough, and the next minute it's a star." The children worked with focused concentration, cutting star after star from the thin dough. Eleanor moved between them, offering guidance and encouragement, helping them transfer the delicate shapes to parchment-lined baking sheets. George discovered that he enjoyed the precision required for the task. "Grandma, if I cut them really carefully, I can fit more stars on each sheet with hardly any waste." "That's the spirit of a true baker," Eleanor praised him. Efficiency and care go hand in hand. Louis, meanwhile, was fascinated by the scraps of leftover dough. "Can we roll these up and cut more stars, Grandma?" "Absolutely. Nothing should go to waste when we're creating something beautiful." As they worked, Eleanor told them more stories about her great-grandmother and the traditions that had shaped her family's Christmas celebrations. She described the small apartment where 6 children would gather around a tiny table, each one taking turns with the single rolling pin. She painted word pictures of how the whole building would smell like cinnamon and almonds during Christmas week, as each family prepared their traditional cookies. In those days, Eleanor explained as she helped Charlotte arrange stars on a baking sheet, families didn't have much money for fancy gifts. The gifts they gave each other were things made with their own hands: cookies, knitted scarves, carved wooden toys. But those gifts meant more than anything you could buy in a store because they were made with love. Charlotte paused in her cutting to look up at Eleanor with serious eyes. "Is that why our cookies taste so good? Because they're made with love?" "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Love is the most important ingredient in any recipe." While the first batch of stars baked in the oven, filling the cottage with the heavenly aroma of cinnamon and almonds, Eleanor began preparing the special icing that would transform the simple cookies into works of art. The traditional recipe called for egg whites beaten with powdered sugar until they formed stiff, glossy peaks that looked like fresh snow. "This is where the real magic happens," Eleanor announced, plugging in the electric mixer. "We're going to make clouds that we can paint on our cookies." The children took turns operating the mixer under Eleanor's careful supervision, watching in amazement as the clear egg whites gradually transformed into a brilliant white mixture that held its shape perfectly. "It looks like the snow outside," Louis exclaimed, reaching out to touch the fluffy icing before Eleanor gently redirected his finger. "It does indeed, and it will taste even sweeter than fresh snow," Eleanor laughed. George studied the bowl of icing with scientific interest. "How does it work, Grandma? How do the egg whites turn into this?" Eleanor was always impressed by George's curiosity about how things worked. "The egg whites contain proteins that trap air when you beat them. All those tiny air bubbles create the fluffy texture. It's like inflating thousands of microscopic balloons." "So we're making balloons out of eggs?" Charlotte giggled. "In a way, yes. Science and magic are often the same thing when you're baking." The timer chimed, announcing that their first batch of cinnamon stars was ready. Eleanor carefully removed the baking sheet from the oven, revealing perfectly golden cookies that had puffed slightly during baking. The stars were beautiful in their simplicity, each one displaying the delicate pattern of the cookie cutter. "They're perfect," Charlotte breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Not quite perfect yet," Eleanor said with a mysterious smile. "Now comes the most important part, decorating them with our special icing." She divided the royal icing into several small bowls, adding different food coloring to each one to create a rainbow of pastel shades: soft pink, pale blue, gentle green, and classic white. The children each chose their preferred colors and learned how to use small spoons to carefully spread the icing over their cookies. "The trick," Eleanor demonstrated, "is to work quickly but gently. The icing will set as it dries, so you want to get it just right the first time." George chose to work with white and blue icing, creating stars that looked like they were touched by frost. His movements were precise and thoughtful, each cookie receiving the same careful attention. Charlotte gravitated toward the pink and white combination, creating cookies that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. She hummed softly as she worked, completely absorbed in the creative process. Louis worked with enthusiastic abandon, using all the colors and creating stars that were more abstract art than traditional cookies. Eleanor praised each child's unique style, understanding that the process was more important than perfection. As they worked, the kitchen filled with comfortable conversation and gentle laughter. Eleanor shared more family stories, the children asked questions about everything from cookie chemistry to family history, and, together they created not just beautiful cookies, but beautiful memories. "Grandma," George said as he carefully placed a finished cookie on the cooling rack, "I think I understand what you mean about traditions being seeds. Every time we do this, it's like we're planting something that will grow in our hearts." Eleanor paused in her own decorating to look at her eldest grandchild with profound love and pride. "My dear boy, you've just expressed something that took me many years to understand. You're growing into quite a wise young man." The afternoon flew by in a blur of baking, decorating, and storytelling. They made batch after batch of cinnamon stars, each one unique and beautiful in its own way. As the cooling racks filled with their creations, Eleanor felt the familiar warm satisfaction that came from sharing her knowledge and love with the next generation. As the last cookies came out of the oven, Charlotte suddenly had another idea. "Grandma, can we write notes to go with the cookies we're giving away? To tell people about the tradition and how special they are." "That's a wonderful idea, Charlotte. What would you like the notes to say?" Charlotte thought carefully, her young face serious with concentration. "I think they should say that the cookies are made with love, and that Christmas is about sharing good things with people you care about." "Perfect," Eleanor agreed, pulling out paper and colored pencils. "Let's write those notes together." As the winter afternoon faded into evening, the cottage glowed with warmth and contentment. The kitchen counters were covered with cooling racks full of beautiful star cookies, the air was perfumed with cinnamon and vanilla, and 3 tired but happy children sat around the table writing heartfelt notes to accompany their gifts. Eleanor looked around at the beautiful chaos of their baking day and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. This was what Christmas was truly about, not the presents or the perfect decorations, but the love shared between generations, the traditions passed down through caring hands, and the joy found in creating something beautiful together. Tomorrow would bring new adventures and more baking magic, but tonight, as she watched her grandchildren carefully packing cookies into gift boxes with handwritten notes, Eleanor knew they had planted seeds of love and generosity that would bloom for many Christmases to come. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight streaming through the frost-covered windows and casting dancing rainbows across the cottage walls. Eleanor had been awake since before sunrise, her excitement matching that of her grandchildren as she prepared for what had become known in their family as Gingerbread Village Day. This was the centerpiece of their Christmas baking weekend, a tradition that had grown more elaborate and magical with each passing year. The kitchen table had been cleared and covered with Eleanor's largest tablecloth, a festive red and green plaid that had belonged to her own mother. Arranged across its surface were all the components needed for their ambitious project: sheets of baked gingerbread in various sizes, bowls of colored royal icing, an assortment of candies that sparkled like precious gems, and Eleanor's special collection of small figurines that would bring their village to life. The children appeared at the top of the stairs one by one, drawn by the magnificent aroma of fresh cinnamon rolls that Eleanor had prepared as a special treat. These weren't just any cinnamon rolls, they were made from a recipe she had adapted specifically for this weekend, incorporating some of the same spices they used in their Christmas cookies. Louis was first down the stairs, his eyes still heavy with sleep but widening with amazement as he saw the transformation of the kitchen. "Grandma! It looks like a magical workshop," he exclaimed, his voice filled with the pure wonder that only a 7-year-old could express. Charlotte followed close behind, her hair braided with ribbon and her face glowing with anticipation. She had been dreaming about this day for weeks, planning in her mind exactly how she wanted to decorate her section of the village. "Oh Grandma, you've already made the gingerbread. Can we start building right now?" George appeared last, moving with the studied casualness of a boy trying to balance his genuine excitement with his growing sense of maturity. But Eleanor could see the spark in his dark eyes, the same spark that had been there when he was Louis's age and believed absolutely in Christmas magic. "Good morning, my master builders," Eleanor greeted them with warm hugs and the promise of hot breakfast. "Today we're going to create something truly spectacular, but first we need fuel for all that hard work." Over breakfast, Eleanor explained the day's plan with the thoroughness of a general preparing for battle, though her battle would be waged with sugar and spice rather than swords and shields. Each child would be responsible for constructing one building in their gingerbread village, but they would work together on the overall design and the magical touches that would make their creation truly special. This year, Eleanor announced with a mysterious smile, "We're not just making any ordinary village. We're creating a place where Christmas magic lives all year round. Every building will have a story, every detail will have meaning, and, when we're finished, we'll have built something that captures the spirit of all our favorite Christmas memories." Charlotte clapped her hands together with delight. "Will there be a bakery like yours, Grandma? With tiny cookies in the window?" "Of course, sweetheart. And, what would you like your building to be?" Charlotte had clearly given this considerable thought. "I want to make a library. With little books and, maybe a reading corner where people go to find Christmas stories." Louis bounced in his seat with excitement. "I want to make a fire station. With candy cane poles for the firefighters to slide down when they need to rescue Christmas trees." George tried to appear nonchalant, but his voice carried unmistakable enthusiasm. "Could I make something like a clock tower? I've been reading about architecture, and I think it would be cool to try making something with different levels and, maybe working parts." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride as she listened to their creative ideas. Each child's choice reflected their personality perfectly, and she could already envision how beautifully their individual visions would come together to create something magical. "Those are all wonderful ideas," she said warmly. "And I have a feeling that when we put them all together with the town square I've planned, we'll have the most enchanting Christmas village anyone has ever seen." After breakfast, they began the careful process of assembling their gingerbread components. Eleanor had spent hours the previous week baking and cutting the various pieces needed for each building, using cardboard templates she had created and refined over the years. The gingerbread was sturdy but not too hard, baked to the perfect consistency for construction while remaining deliciously edible. Building with gingerbread, Eleanor explained as she demonstrated the proper technique for applying royal icing mortar, is like building with any other material, except our mistakes taste wonderful. This comment elicited giggles from all three children and helped ease any performance anxiety they might have felt about creating something perfect. Charlotte started with her library, carefully joining the walls with thick lines of white icing. Eleanor had helped her design a charming building with large windows that would showcase tiny book displays, and a rounded door that gave it a fairy tale appearance. As the icing set and the walls held steady, Charlotte's face lit up with the satisfaction of successful engineering. "It's really working," she announced with surprise and delight. "I'm actually building a real building." Louis approached his fire station with characteristic enthusiasm, spreading icing with generous abandon and pressing the gingerbread pieces together with firm confidence. His building style was more intuitive than precise, but the results had a charming, organic quality that somehow looked exactly right for his whimsical vision. George studied his clock tower components with the intensity of a master architect, measuring distances with a ruler and consulting the sketch he had made during breakfast. His approach was methodical and thoughtful, each piece placed with careful consideration for both structural integrity and aesthetic appeal. Eleanor moved between her grandchildren like a master craftsman overseeing skilled apprentices, offering guidance when needed but mostly allowing them to discover their own solutions to construction challenges. She understood that the real learning happened when they worked through problems independently, gaining confidence with each small success. "Grandma," George called out as he worked on fitting together the complex pieces of his clock tower base, "this is harder than I thought it would be." How do you make sure everything lines up perfectly? Eleanor came over to examine his work, impressed by the ambition of his design. You know, George, sometimes the most beautiful buildings aren't the ones where everything lines up perfectly. Sometimes the little irregularities and unexpected angles are what give a building its character and charm. She showed him how to use small amounts of extra icing to fill gaps and create strong joints, turning potential flaws into design features. In real architecture, they call this working with the materials. The gingerbread has its own personality, and part of being a good builder is learning to work with that personality rather than against it. This lesson seemed to relax George considerably, and he began approaching his project with more creativity and less anxiety about perfection. As his clock tower took shape, it developed a wonderful, slightly whimsical character that was far more interesting than a perfectly symmetrical structure would have been. Charlotte was deep in concentration as she created tiny details for her library. Using colored icing and a steady hand, she painted miniature book spines on the windows, each one a different color and size. Eleanor watched with amazement as her granddaughter created an entire world in miniature, complete with a tiny reading chair made from a small piece of gingerbread and a welcome mat crafted from a thin pretzel stick. These books need titles, Charlotte announced with scholarly seriousness. This one is Christmas Stories for Everyone, and this one is How to Bake Magic Cookies, and this one is The Secret Life of Gingerbread People. Eleanor laughed with delight at Charlotte's creativity. Those sound like books I would love to read myself. Louis had moved beyond basic construction to the decoration phase of his fire station, and his vision was proving to be both ambitious and charmingly impractical. He was attempting to create a functional slide system using curved pieces of gingerbread and liberal amounts of icing, while simultaneously building a fleet of tiny fire trucks from graham crackers and red candies. The firefighters need to be ready for any Christmas emergency, he explained seriously as he attached peppermint wheels to one of his vehicles. Like if someone's Christmas tree gets stuck in a chimney, or if a gingerbread house catches fire, or if Santa's sleigh breaks down and needs to be towed. Eleanor marveled at the complex scenarios playing out in Louis's imagination. His fire station was becoming less of a building and more of an elaborate play set, complete with working parts and intricate storylines. As the morning progressed into afternoon, their individual buildings began to take shape with remarkable personality and charm. Eleanor had prepared the base for their village using a large wooden board covered with artificial snow and carefully placed mirror pieces to represent frozen ponds. When it came time to position their completed buildings, the children worked together to create a layout that told a story. Charlotte's library was placed at the heart of the village, its warm, welcoming windows suggesting that it was the kind of place where neighbors gathered to share stories and stay warm on cold winter days. George's clock tower was positioned on a small hill overlooking the village square, its impressive height and elegant design making it a natural landmark. Louis's fire station was strategically located with clear access to all the other buildings, ready to respond to any emergency that might arise in their miniature world. Eleanor added her own contribution, a small bakery with a peaked roof and windows that glowed with warm yellow light. She had prepared tiny trays of miniature cookies and cakes, each one carefully crafted to look realistic despite being made from the same gingerbread and icing as everything else. Now comes the real magic, Eleanor announced, bringing out several boxes she had kept hidden until this moment. Inside were tiny LED lights, miniature figurines, and an assortment of natural materials like small pine cones, twigs, and moss that would transform their village from a collection of buildings into a living, breathing world. The children watched with wide eyes as Eleanor demonstrated how to thread the tiny lights through the buildings, creating the warm glow that would make their village look inhabited and welcoming. Each building received its own lighting scheme, soft yellow light for the cozy library, bright white light for the practical fire station, and a gentle multicolored glow for the clock tower that suggested something magical happening inside. "It's like we're bringing the buildings to life," Charlotte whispered in amazement as her library began to glow from within. That's exactly what we're doing, Eleanor agreed. Every village needs people living in it, lights in the windows, and signs that life is happening inside. They spent the next hour adding the finishing touches that would make their village complete. George crafted a tiny weather vane for his clock tower from a toothpick and small pieces of gingerbread. Charlotte created a miniature garden beside her library, using rosemary sprigs as evergreen trees and small candies as flowers. Louis built an elaborate obstacle course behind his fire station where the gingerbread firefighters could practice their rescue skills. Eleanor contributed her own special touches, a network of pathways connecting all the buildings, made from crushed graham crackers that looked remarkably like gravel roads. She added tiny benches in the village square, street lamps made from pretzel sticks and gumdrops, and even a small frozen pond where miniature figurines could ice skate. As the afternoon light began to fade, they gathered around their completed village with a sense of profound accomplishment. The combination of architecture, artistry, and imagination had resulted in something truly magical, a miniature world that seemed to contain all the wonder and warmth of Christmas itself. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Charlotte said softly, her voice filled with awe. "It looks like a place where anything could happen," Louis added, already inventing stories about the adventures the tiny villagers might have. George studied their creation with the appreciative eye of a fellow craftsman. "Grandma, this is amazing. It looks like something you'd see in a museum or a really expensive store." Eleanor felt tears of joy prick at the corners of her eyes as she looked at the village they had created together and at the three beautiful faces glowing with pride and satisfaction. "My dear children, this is better than anything you could see in a museum or buy in a store, because we made it together with our own hands and our own love." She reached for her camera, an old film camera that had belonged to her late husband, and began taking pictures of their masterpiece. But, more importantly, she took mental pictures, images of Charlotte carefully adjusting a tiny book in the library window, Louis making sound effects as he moved the fire trucks around their station, and George explaining to his younger siblings how the clock tower mechanism would work if it were real. These were the moments that mattered, Eleanor realized. Not the perfect execution of a plan, but the joy of discovery, the satisfaction of creation, and the bond strengthened through shared accomplishment. Their gingerbread village would eventually be eaten or would grow stale and be thrown away, but the memories they had created while building it would last forever. As evening approached and they prepared for dinner, the children were reluctant to leave their village, even for a moment. They had become deeply invested in the tiny world they had brought to life, and each wanted to continue adding details and refinements. "Can we work on it more tomorrow?" Charlotte asked hopefully. "Can we make more buildings?" Louis chimed in. "Maybe a school, or a movie theater, or a place where they make toys. Can we keep it up until after Christmas?" George added. "I want to show Mom and Dad how everything works." Eleanor smiled at their enthusiasm, remembering her own childhood fascination with miniature worlds and the way they could capture imagination so completely. "We can absolutely keep working on it tomorrow, and we'll leave it up as long as you'd like. Part of the magic of creating something beautiful is being able to enjoy it for as long as possible." As they reluctantly moved away from the table to wash their hands for dinner, Eleanor took one last long look at their gingerbread village. In the growing darkness of evening, with the tiny lights twinkling like stars and the carefully crafted details telling stories of community and care, it looked like the kind of place where Christmas magic really could live all year round. Tomorrow would bring the final day of their weekend tradition, with new projects and new memories to be made. But, tonight, as she watched her grandchildren chattering excitedly about their village over dinner, Eleanor knew that they had accomplished something truly special. They had built more than just a collection of gingerbread buildings, they had constructed a shared dream, a physical representation of the love and creativity that flowed between generations. The tradition was growing and evolving, just as traditions should, with each year bringing new ideas and new possibilities while maintaining the essential spirit of togetherness and joy that made it magical. And, as Eleanor listened to her grandchildren planning improvements and additions for the following year, she knew that the seeds of love and creativity they were planting together would continue to bloom for many Christmases to come. Sunday morning arrived with a gentle melancholy that often accompanies the final day of something wonderful. Eleanor woke to find fresh snow had fallen during the night, adding another pristine layer to their winter wonderland and creating the perfect backdrop for their last day together. She lay in bed for a few extra moments, listening to the peaceful silence of the cottage and feeling grateful for every precious second of this magical weekend. This was always the most bittersweet day of their Christmas tradition, filled with the completion of their projects and the satisfaction of accomplishment, but also shadowed by the knowledge that their special time together was drawing to a close. Eleanor had learned over the years to embrace both the joy and the sadness of these moments, understanding that the temporary nature of their gatherings was part of what made them so precious. She rose quietly and made her way to the kitchen, pausing to admire their gingerbread village, which looked even more enchanting in the soft morning light filtering through the snow-covered windows. The tiny LED lights still twinkled cheerfully, and she could almost imagine the miniature residents going about their morning routines in the cozy buildings her grandchildren had created with such love and care. Today's tradition was perhaps the most meaningful of all, the Great Cookie Share. This was when they would package up all their beautiful creations from the weekend, keeping some for their own families but sharing the majority with neighbors, friends, and anyone who might need a little Christmas magic in their lives. It was Eleanor's way of teaching her grandchildren that the true joy of creating something beautiful came from sharing it with others. She started the coffee and began preparing their final special breakfast, French toast made with thick slices of homemade bread and flavored with vanilla and cinnamon. As the sweet aroma filled the kitchen, she heard the familiar sound of feet on the stairs, though today they moved with less exuberant energy than on previous mornings. Even the children seemed to sense that this day carried a different weight. Charlotte was first to appear, moving quietly in her slippers and pajamas, her hair still tousled from sleep. She went directly to the gingerbread village and stood studying it with the serious attention of an art critic examining a masterpiece. "Good morning, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly, not wanting to break the peaceful mood. "How did you sleep?" "I dreamed about our village again," Charlotte replied, her voice thoughtful. But this time the dream was different. The tiny people in the buildings were real, and they were getting ready for Christmas morning. The library was full of children listening to Christmas stories, and everyone was so happy. Eleanor felt her heart squeeze with emotion at Charlotte's words. "That sounds like a beautiful dream. Maybe that's what happens to our gingerbread village when we're not watching, maybe it comes alive with its own Christmas magic." George appeared next, and Eleanor was struck by how much older he seemed than when they had arrived just 2 days ago. There was something in his expression that suggested he was beginning to understand the deeper meanings behind their traditions, the way they connected past and future, the way they created bonds that would last long after the cookies were eaten and the decorations were put away. "Morning, Grandma," he said, giving her a hug that lasted a little longer than usual. "I was thinking, this weekend has been really special. Not just fun, but important somehow." Eleanor smiled at his attempt to articulate feelings that were beyond his 11-year-old vocabulary. "You're growing up, my dear boy. You're starting to understand that some experiences touch our hearts in ways that stay with us forever." Louis bounced down the stairs with his characteristic energy, but even he seemed quieter than usual. He went straight to the gingerbread village and began moving the tiny figurines around, creating little scenes and storylines that brought the miniature world to life. "Grandma," he said as he repositioned a tiny sledding family near the village pond, "when we go home, will our village miss us?" Eleanor knelt down beside him, touched by the innocent wisdom of his question. "You know what I think, Louis. I think our village will keep all the love and happiness we put into it, and, whenever we remember this weekend, it will still be here in our hearts, just as magical as it is right now." Over breakfast, Eleanor explained their final tradition with the same care and attention she brought to all their activities. Each child would choose special recipients for their homemade gifts, write personal notes explaining the tradition behind their cookies, and help package everything in beautiful boxes that Eleanor had prepared specifically for this purpose. The most important part, Eleanor emphasized, is thinking about each person as you prepare their gift. We're not just giving them cookies, we're sharing a piece of the love and joy we've created together this weekend. Charlotte immediately thought of Mrs. Thompson, the elderly widow who lived alone at the end of Eleanor Street. She always waves to us from her window when we visit you, Grandma. I want to give her some of our prettiest cookies and tell her about how we made them together. George suggested their mail carrier, who had been delivering letters to Eleanor's cottage for over 15 years and always stopped to chat about the weather or compliment her garden. He works so hard, especially during the holidays. I bet he'd really appreciate something homemade. Louis wanted to give cookies to the children at the local hospital. He had heard his parents talking about children who had to spend Christmas in the hospital, and his young heart couldn't bear the thought of anyone being away from their family during the holidays. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the compassion and thoughtfulness her grandchildren displayed so naturally. Those are all perfect choices, my dears. You've learned the most important lesson about Christmas, that giving with love is what makes the season truly magical. They spent the morning carefully packaging their weekend's worth of baking into beautiful gift boxes. Eleanor had saved decorative tins and boxes throughout the year, and she had ribbons, tissue paper, and labels ready for their gift-wrapping assembly line. Each child took responsibility for preparing gifts for their chosen recipients, writing heartfelt notes that Eleanor would help them deliver over the coming week. Charlotte's note to Mrs. Thompson read, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, we made these cookies with my grandma using a recipe that's over 100 years old. When you eat them, think about all the love that went into making them, and know that you're part of our family's Christmas tradition now. Love, Charlotte." George wrote to Mr. Peterson, their mail carrier, "Mr. Peterson, thank you for bringing letters even when it's snowing. These cookies are made from my great-great-grandmother's recipe. My grandma says that traditions are like seeds that grow when we share them, so we're sharing ours with you. From George and family." Louis dictated his note to Eleanor, since his writing skills weren't quite up to expressing his big feelings. "To all the kids in the hospital, we made these cookies in my grandma's kitchen where it's warm and cozy and full of love. We hope they taste like hugs and make you feel better. When you eat them, pretend you're here with us building gingerbread villages and making Christmas magic. Love, Louis and his family." As they worked on their gift preparation, Eleanor shared more stories about the importance of community and connection during the holiday season. She told them about Christmas traditions from around the world, about the way different cultures expressed the same universal desire to share love and joy during the darkest time of the year. In Germany, where our cinnamon star recipe comes from, she explained as they tied ribbons on gift boxes, they have a tradition called Keksteller, cookie plates that families prepare and share with neighbors and friends. In Mexico, they make special cookies called polvorones, that melt in your mouth like snowflakes. In Greece, they bake kura beads that are covered in powdered sugar like little snow domes. Charlotte looked up from the ribbon she was carefully curling. So all over the world, people are making cookies and sharing them with people they care about? Exactly, sweetheart. That's what makes our tradition so special. We're part of something bigger than just our own family. We're part of a worldwide family of people who believe in the magic of sharing homemade love." George carefully placed the last batch of cinnamon stars in a decorative tin. "Grandma, I hope I remember everything you've taught us this weekend. I want to be able to do this with my own children someday." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride and hope. "You will remember, my dear boy. These kinds of memories live in your heart forever, and, when the time comes, you'll find that you know exactly what to do." As the afternoon wore on, they reluctantly began the process of cleaning up their baking supplies and packing away the special tools and decorations that had made their weekend so magical. Each child wanted to help preserve their gingerbread village, carefully photographing it from every angle and discussing how they might recreate it next year. "Could we make it even bigger next year?" Louis asked as he gently removed the tiny figurines for safekeeping. "Could we add a train that goes around the whole village?" Charlotte suggested, her imagination already racing toward future possibilities. "Maybe we could make different buildings," George added thoughtfully. "Like a town hall, or a school, or maybe even a castle." Eleanor smiled at their enthusiasm for future projects, understanding that this was how traditions grew and evolved, through the creative energy and fresh ideas that each generation brought to the table. As evening approached and their parents prepared for the drive home, the children gathered around Eleanor for their traditional final moments together. This was always the hardest part, saying goodbye and returning to regular life after 3 days of intensive togetherness and magic. But Eleanor had developed a special ritual for this moment, one that helped ease the transition and reminded them that their connection wasn't limited to their weekend gatherings. "Before you go," she said, gathering them close on the living room sofa, "I want each of you to choose one special cookie to take home, not to eat, but to keep as a reminder of our weekend together." The children carefully selected their memorial cookies. Charlotte chose a perfectly decorated cinnamon star, George selected a piece of architectural gingerbread from his clock tower, and Louis picked a miniature fire truck from his elaborate emergency response fleet. "These cookies will remind you that no matter where you are or what you're doing, the love we shared this weekend is always with you," Eleanor explained. "And, whenever you look at them, you can remember that you're part of a tradition that stretches back through generations and forward into the future." Charlotte hugged her chosen cookie gently. "Will you think about us when we're gone, Grandma?" "Every single day," Eleanor replied honestly. "And, do you know what I'll remember most? Not just the cookies we made or the village we built, but the way you three worked together, took care of each other, and shared your love so generously with people you've never even met." As the family loaded their car with suitcases, gift boxes, and precious cookies, Eleanor stood on her porch watching the scene with a heart full of bittersweet joy. The cottage would feel empty without their laughter and energy, but it would also feel full of the love and memories they had created together. George was the last to hug her goodbye, and she could see in his eyes the same awareness that she felt, that something precious was ending, but something even more precious would continue forever. "Thank you, Grandma," he said simply. "For everything. For making Christmas magical and for teaching us what really matters." Eleanor watched until their car disappeared around the corner, its taillights twinkling like red stars in the gathering darkness. Then, she went back inside to her quiet cottage, where the gingerbread village still glowed softly in the kitchen and the lingering aroma of cinnamon and love filled every room. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at their creation one more time. In the morning, she would carefully dismantle it, saving the special pieces and cleaning up the rest. But, for tonight, she wanted to sit with the magic they had created and think about all the ways this tradition had enriched their lives. She thought about Charlotte's natural compassion and generosity, about George's growing wisdom and thoughtfulness, about Louis's boundless imagination and enthusiastic spirit. She thought about how these three children were carrying forward the love and values that had been passed down through generations of their family, adding their own unique gifts to the ongoing story. Most of all, she thought about how traditions really did work like seeds, planted with love, tended with care, and blooming in ways that continued to surprise and delight year after year. This weekend had planted new seeds in all their hearts, and Eleanor had the deep satisfaction of knowing that those seeds would continue to grow and bloom long after she was no longer here to tend them personally. The tradition would continue, carried forward by loving hands and generous hearts, creating new magic for future generations while honoring the love and wisdom of those who came before. And, in that continuity, in that endless cycle of love given and received, Eleanor found the true meaning of Christmas, not in any single moment or gift or celebration, but in the ongoing choice to share love, create beauty, and build connections that transcend time and distance. As she finally turned off the village lights and made her way upstairs to bed, Eleanor whispered a prayer of gratitude for this beautiful weekend and for the privilege of being part of something so much larger and more meaningful than any individual life. The tradition would continue, the love would endure, and, somewhere in the future, new voices would gather around kitchen tables to create their own Christmas magic, connected across the years by the invisible threads of family love and shared traditions. And that, Eleanor thought as she drifted off to sleep, was the most beautiful Christmas gift of all.